Today what I've got prepared for us is an exploration of savory or umami, which is a taste exemplified by the interplay of three particular compounds we're going to talk about. And in order to explore that, what I'm going to do is prepare mushrooms and onions, or rather mushrooms, onions, and garlic, and pork chop, and to season the both of those with miso. And so that's what we're going to do.
Okay, what you can see here, I've just got the onion, the mushroom, and the garlic out. Notice I've got my pork chops marinating. All I did here, I didn't do anything particularly special. It's just some water, some salt. I threw some limes in there and a little bit of vinegar. And all I was really doing there was changing the pH, making it a bit more acidic to tenderize the meat, make it softer, more receptive to what I'm about to do. So now I'm breading it. What I've chosen here to bread in is buckwheat flour. And so, as you can hear that sizzling in the pan, the breading on the outside, all I'm really doing, and one of the things that breading does that's really nice, is I'm allowing for an additional sort of thing to have that's going to brown and go through a caramelization reaction. You can hear it sizzling there. All that's really going to do is go through what's called the Maillard reaction, and basically any amino acid plus a sugar plus heat is going to make browning in sort of a runaway kind of process that's going to give a ton of really flavorful chromatic compounds. And so all I'm doing is adding the rest of the flour, or buckwheat flour, for breading there. Now, what you'll see me do at this point is to start chopping up some garlic and some onions. And now, sort of raw garlic and raw onions have kind of a tearful, spicy sort of a flavor to it, and they have quite the effect on the eyes if you all have ever cut onions. What's happening there, and it's sort of a defense compound for the plant, is you've got a couple storage vacuoles in the center of the onion and garlic cells, and an unsuspecting creature like myself with this knife comes along, breaks the cells, those vacuoles combine, and you get what's called propanethiol S oxide. Gets produced as a gas whenever they combine together, and that's the thing that combines gas, sort of wafts up to your eyes and makes a wonderful little sulfuric sort of acid, or sulfur-based acid, on your eyes that you then dilute with tears. But for our purposes, we're not so interested in that. And here you see me cutting the onion. There are tricks to cut an onion such that you don't get quite so tearful, or you can just bear it. It's up to you. But for my part, I'm less interested in sort of that spicy kind of onion flavor as I am in what I can get caramelization-wise through oxidation of the sugars in the onion and in the garlic under heat. You can get wonderful sweet, nutty, sort of buttery kind of flavors. If you ever look on ingredient lists, they're listed under, quote, natural flavors, but when they sort of cheat these into dishes. But for our part, this is going to add something really nice to the dish, largely because what we're going to do with the umami flavors, with the savory stuff later, is going to accentuate this and bring it out. But we'll get there in just a moment. As you can see, chopping them up, and this is where those cells would be breaking. The more of them I break, the more wonderful tearfulness you can get. You can hear my timer going off there. What I've done is I've set a timer based on the heat and knowing my stove, and I'm using that to know when I've got things up to temp for caramelization, and for the Maillard reaction to occur. So now I'm just giving it a flip. Now as you can see, the buckwheat flour is quite dark. You'll see me doing some of this in the pan, but the pork chop is going to be finished off in the stove. Or sorry, in the oven. Now, while I'm doing this, it's worthwhile to go ahead and introduce you guys to the next sort of thing. So what I've got there is miso. And miso is really handy because what it adds is one of my umami flavors. And so umami comes in three types. Glutamaics, rather, savory flavors come in three types, and they combine in an interesting way. So the one I'm adding there with the miso paste is what's called a glutamate, and broths and fermented foods. Anything that sort of has gone through microbial processes tends to provide that. Now, savory for us is what's an indicator taste. It tells the body about the nutrition of the food, and so it's less about what's being tasted there. And you see me adding some bacon grease, which we'll add another, which we'll talk about in a moment. But it's less about the flavor itself, as you know, that's to say the compound that makes the flavor, as it is what that's telling the body the food has in it, which is why savory flavors combine in the way they do. We'll talk about that in a second. But the one I added there was miso. It's a fermented soybean sort of thing. But that fermentation process has it's bacteriological, and that tells the body that, hey, there's a slew of proteins and amino acids associated with those microbes. Now you see me adding mushrooms. Mushrooms add another savory to them. These guys add what's called guanolates. And guanolates you get from vegetables and mushrooms. Ton of them in mushrooms. You see me flipping this over now. The reason that I'm adding the mushrooms, right? So I added the miso, so that gave me one class of savory compound, the glutamates. The guanolates that the mushrooms are going to add is from a different class. It's a different sort of structure of compound in a way that the body can tell, in a way that your taste buds can pick up the difference between. And if you add across chemical classes, so let's say I added 3 or 4 different types of broths or fermented foods, those would combine in an additive way. And here you see me dropping the pork chops onto a baking dish, popping that in the oven, forgetting to set my timer, pulling those off of heat so that they don't smoke. I don't want to smoke the oil. But now I've still got the miso stuck to the pan, and I've added my onions, and now I'm going to finish sort of moving those around. But when I add those mushrooms, I'll be adding across chemical classes, and evolutionarily we're sort of primed for really desiring foods that add across chemical classes when it comes to savory, because that tells you that you're getting a different class of, and the bacon grease, as well as the pork chop, is another class as well. I'll talk about that in a moment. But when you add across chemical classes, the flavors don't add, they multiply. And multiplying, 3 plus 3 and 3 times 3 give you very different numbers. So now we add the guanylytes, that's our mushrooms. And I'm just going to chop these the rest of the way up. During that time, it's worthwhile talking about the savoriness that the pork chop is adding to the dish. So that's the inocinates, your seafoods and meats. You've got sort of taste receptor response to, and they're going to add another class of savory compound. So when we sort of combine the three of these together, what we'll end up with is a much more flavorful dish, because what that's telling sort of the body is, hey, what you've got here is a very complete set of proteins and amino acids that are readily digestible, which means for better nutrition, and that's why you have that taste receptor in the first place, is to prime you in for saying, okay, well, hey, I've got something somewhat different here, and as a result, I get a healthier meal. Now, this process can get cheated. So, for instance, back in the early sort of, I think 1906, fella over in Japan, so over there they've got sort of seaweed soup bases, kombu, isolated the compound in the glutamate that was in kombu, and gave us MSG as a flavor additive. And this is the thing that, like, you ever go to a restaurants, particularly gets used a lot in sort of the Americanized Chinese food and Americanized sort of Mexican food. So if you go to like a Taco Bell or a anywhere you would get like a General Tso's chicken, what they're doing is they're adding MSG to add for flavor. Well, Taco Bell, it's MSG and cumin, and then what that's doing is it's they're adding across classes with that glutamate, but it's not, since it's you're adding the compound by itself without all of the nutrition associated with it. It's kind of cheating. It makes for flavorful food, doesn't make for very nutritious food. Now, you can see that my onions here, they've sort of, I've sweated the onions. So what I've done there is I've sort of, I haven't got them fully onto caramelization yet. They've been sautéed, and so notice how they're soft, they're clear, they're translucent. They're not going to have that spiciness to them anymore. They'll have an entirely different flavor now. But they've also got that miso in there with them, and what the glutamate is going to do, and just scraping the rest of that off of the the fork there, to give it, to add a little bit of it. Waste not, want not, after all. But what that's going to add is it's going to bring out a ton of the flavor associated with those onions and the garlic there. And then when I add the mushrooms, I'm going to do that as well as bringing a bit of liquid into the dish, because the mushrooms by themselves, before you cook them, they don't have a lot of flavor. They've got a wonderful bite to them, a wonderful crunch, but which will go away with cooking. But they get much more flavorful once you... There's me adding the timer that I forgot for the pork chops. as you can see, caramelization started. So that's that browning you can see on the onions there. And that's an indicator of the Maillard reaction, which sort of a runaway 3-step kind of a process that's going to give you a ton of wonderful flavors. That's what we get with fried foods, you see. It's what makes fried foods taste so tasty. Also, the browning on the outside of a good steak. So I've just freed up some of the pan there. Give my mushrooms nice contact with the skillet. Notice whenever I'm scraping them off the cutting board, I'm using the back side of the knife. Help preserve your knife's edge a bit. Other useful thing to know from a sort of chemistry of cooking standpoint. So I'm working with a cast iron skillet. Cast iron skillets are sort of the seasoned surface of them is something that you can use a metal spatula with. If I was in a non-stick skillet, I wouldn't be using a metal spatula. I'd be using either a plastic one or a wooden spoon or something. The reason being is that the non-stick surface associated with that is easy to take off with a metal skillet, and you don't want to eat your skillet. You want to eat your food. Adding a little bit of oil to the other skillet over there to help preserve the seasoning on the cast iron as it cools off. But seasoning of a cast iron skillet and exactly how that works is a topic for another video. Incidentally, that other cast iron skillet in the back there is over 80 years old. So, cast iron's a good investment in long term. Now, as you can see here, I've moved things down to low. I'm no longer interested in caramelizing or having the Maillard reaction. Caramelization occurs much higher temperatures, 160 or so. Now, what you see me doing here is I'm looking for an internal temperature in the pork of about 145 Fahrenheit. In Celsius, that's 63, for those of y'all who cook in Celsius. And I don't really want to go much above that. I'm going to get some carryover cooking anyway. So here they are pulled out. Now, cooking pork, it's really easy if you go over temperature to end up with a really gross overcooked pork chop that is nothing but chewy. So that's why, the minute you hit 145, it's worthwhile to pull it off. And as you can see, if you pull it off at the right time, see how quickly the knife went through? So will your teeth. And so you won't have a ton of chewiness, you'll just have tenderness. It's tender pork, much tastier. Juices run clear, everything's cooked all the way through. Now, I've added, putting my sort of sauce from my handy dandy onions and mushrooms, and that's that.